Second keynote speaker is the British artist, writer and editor Hannah Black. Hannah was born in Manchester but lives in New York. She works conceptually, but through a codependence between thinking and feeling. Her work is often developed through conversation or collaboration, and often features text or voice in print and video and performance. And her work also often features objects as work in themselves or as prop-like devices to support other media. Now, I've known Hannah's critical writing and reflective essays for a number of years, from her work for the New Inquiry, and then more experimentally from her first book Onwards, Dark Pool Party. But it was Hannah's solo show at the Chisenhale Gallery in London in 2017 that was the first consolidated exhibition of her practice that I saw. Now, that show was kind of complicated and simple at the same time. It was structured by a sculptural loop between 20,000 copies of one publication and then small clusters of everyday objects. Now, conceptually, that loop seemed to be brought together by the title of the publication stacked up in the room. The title was The Situation, which seemed to be about a kind of ambient or flexible category of angst. But for me, the loop was actually tied by a surrogate title shared by several of the objects in that show. And that title was Transitional Object, which is a psychological concept pioneered by Donald Winnicott about the way we use objects to help us understand object-subject relations until they stop serving a function, and then we abandon them. And that idea of the transitional object is one that I've used to try and ground some understanding of how Hannah works through the context of contemporary art, but also expresses very mixed feelings about that context. Now, that show at Chisenhale really stayed with me as a kind of choreographed expression of a really sophisticated practice. An artist who's willing to be vulnerable, maybe even uneven at times, when it allows them to take real risk, which for me is the hallmark of a really exciting artist. More recently, there was a great interview with Hannah in the November 2020 issue of Art Monthly, much of which directly addressed her different interests in writing and making art. So the coincidence of the timing of that interview put Hannah right at the top of our thinking when we first started to plan this conference. And I'm delighted she agreed to join us. So I'm going to get out of the way now, and I'm going to hand over to you, Hannah. So Hannah's going to be screen sharing during her talk. And yeah, I'll keep an eye on the chat and whatnot. So thank you, Hannah.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm going to mainly, I'm going to do something that's a little like an artist talk, but I'm going to try and, as much as possible, kind of reflect on the various relationships between sculpture and literature, or sculpture and poetry. And I feel I'm uniquely fitted to speak at this, if just for purely kind of like life historical reasons. I actually came through, I studied English literature. I come from more of a writing background, and art came into my life like kind of, I didn't study art until my late 20s. So it was a really interesting prompt, because I do think a lot about, obviously I think a lot about the relation between writing and objects and so on. And in some senses my practice is more, is basically grounded in writing. And it's kind of actually unusually lacking in a kind of like going through materials, which is probably one of the sources of the unevenness that Nick was mentioning. But obviously I do give myself a lot of freedom through doing that. So I'm just going to share the screen so you can see images of the shows as I talk about them. I think I might have a bit more than 40 minutes, but we'll see how it goes, and you can just keep telling me if the time starts to go over a lot. Thank you so much for being here and listening and so on. So the first show I'm going to start with is actually my most recent exhibition, and this was an extremely bizarre process of a very bizarre making process. Probably one, as I just mentioned, I think I do have a fairly abstracted and conceptual making process, but this was even more so because of I don't know, probably as most of you know, the current COVID border rules. I live here on a visa. It's pretty hard to travel right now, so I ended up doing, we installed via Zoom, and this show's in Zurich, and I actually haven't seen it physically in real life. I mean, I've been shown around on video and so on, but I haven't seen it in real life. So this is a show called The Wheel of Fortune, and it actually came out of feelings that a feeling of kind of like radical contingency, or kind of like a sort of almost overwhelming sense of happenstance from I guess early like pre-vaccine pandemic, and the sense of a kind of sudden event like befalling everyone. Actually, while I was anyway, so I actually had the part of the Wheel of Fortune tarot card tattooed on my leg when I was in Mexico City trying to get back to the States where I live from England, where I got stuck in the early pandemic. So this is, I mean, the show's quite a complicated layout, so it's good. It might be a little bit visually difficult to understand, but basically there's this existing structure that's a pavilion by the Swiss architect Baram, that's like the silver structure in the background. That's not by me, but I kind of integrated it into the show. And this is to the right of the image, you can see a wheel and it says redivider, which is a palindrome, and it kind of circles and a light falls through it, and the light falls onto different objects. This is the work that begins the show. It's kind of it's like a rug in the style of a kind of promotional rug, like you might get in a store or in a shop or whatever, kind of very mass produced. But it's and I use this phrase that's actually from a Jungian self-help book, which is what happens to me is for me. It's a sort of like standard, almost like Etsy cushion kind of reassuring phrase. The idea that everything that happens to you is somehow not I guess like meant in a kind of very low sense, or in a very kind of minor sense, like everything that happens to you is meant to happen to you in the sense that it does happen to you, so then it's just what's happened. So I mean that's at least how I understand it. And so then, and I was struck by as you can see with the hopefully you can notice with the underlinings, so I also was playing with this idea of like what happens to me is for me, but also what happens to me is form. And that was an idea of a kind of contingency of form, like the idea of form is kind of almost arising kind of at random or by happenstance. I guess, again, coming out of this feeling of a kind of, that we're living in an era because there's so many kind of like chaotic inputs, kind of disease, climate change, kind of what feels like a sort of like more like emotion driven kind of political sphere or whatever. So this idea that there's these forms, social forms and so on, that are kind of contingently arising, and that was also a way of thinking about making objects, or making I mean, maybe for me makes more sense to say making an installation than making objects, because I think actually in some ways less is invested in the individual objects. And then as you'll also see, the sand, it's like construction sand that's just like on top of it. And this was an attempt to kind of, again, like emphasize, sorry, I have some notes I'm trying to read from as well, to kind of emphasize it. I think there's a way I'm trying to like seed authorship. Like obviously I'm authoring the show and I'm also trying to seed authorship at the same time. So I think one of the gestures I made to the idea of a kind of contingency of form was to kind of add this sand on the floor. And then my idea was that as people walk through the show, the position of the sand would alter in ways that I don't have any control over. Sometimes when I make these kinds of gestures, it occurs to me that it's actually even more controlling to add something that's kind of signaling lack of control, that actually almost like raises controllingness to a higher level, as if I also have to, there's something about like I also have to be involved in what is beyond me, but that's just something maybe I think about. So in terms of how this, I mean, obviously there's a lot, I mean, as you'll see as I go through these different examples, I definitely like use writing as material, or I use literature as material. I think, and I want to talk about that a bit more later. So there is writing in this show, but actually it's one of my less kind of written, it has less text than I usually have, I think. It actually began as, so I think one of the ways this does relate to a kind of like thinking that I might do in a piece of writing is that there's a sort of like set of like interrelationships between the objects that amounts to something a little bit like an argument. And wait, I'm going to show you some more of these so you can yeah. Okay, so basically, this is the exterior of the pavilion that was kind of reproduced inside this room that's by this architect. And then this is, so inside, so I kind of treated the pavilion as if inside the pavilion there was a more conventional, almost like painting show. So these like painted wooden boards, circular boards, and I made a pretty conventional this is a pretty conventional, I think in some ways quite a conventional take on the medieval Wheel of Fortune. I'm also really interested in astrology just in my personal life and in general as a kind of conceptual frame. And there's a kind of interesting thing in the history of astrology where, which was obviously very popular in ancient Greece, and to the extent that like various political leaders would publish their birth charts to show what a kind of well-favored birth they'd had and how they were like very suited to be powerful. And then actually one of the arguments of how Christianity became popular is because it offered something other than a kind of like random. It kind of undid an idea of fatedness or whatever. So Christianity came in as a kind of way of thinking differently about fate. So instead of it being set at birth, or in some ways you just have to kind of accommodate yourself to the ways that your character is a kind of fate. Again, something I'm going to come to later. So the ways that character is a kind of fate, you could instead do good deeds and kind of have a good relationship with God, and that would change your destiny and so on. So that was one of the things I was thinking about. And then another thing I was thinking about was the kind of capture of chance and the capture of happenstance by capitalism in the form of financial markets. And so that's I'm not sure if you can see it in any of these actually, unfortunately, but if you can see the wooden there's these little wooden stands that the light is going through, and they actually have police accident reports on them. So that was I downloaded like just accident reports in the sense of like car accidents and so on. I downloaded a few of those, all of which happened to be on the date of my birthday, and I mean not when I was originally born, but like the day, and just as a whatever, because I guess I was also thinking about birthing and so on, being born. But yeah, so there's an idea of the light falls through the police, kind of. So there's a kind of capturing of happenstance or capturing of randomness. Although in some ways the randomness in this show is kind of a bit fake. So what this had originally cut, this is how I'm going to get to. So I was thinking about how, as much as I think I can read this show as a kind of almost written argument, and it does obviously, as you can see, use text in various ways. And I would usually kind of get into more like more like description of what's actually happening in these objects, but I feel like we don't have time because I want to talk about them more. So this is, as you can see, the light falls through the various things, and like at this point it kind of activates the sculpture that develops a face, and sometimes it falls on this, which is an ad for a GameStop store, which, if you remember, was involved in this kind of exciting news story about ordinary people using the financial market to make money or whatever, which I feel is pretty politically neutral, to be honest. Oh yeah, sorry, here's a better picture of the police accident report, and in this case it's falling onto a printer. It then causes the printer to print a randomized Mandelbrot image, which is kind of algorithmically generated image. Oh, that's the next thing. So I was thinking, so the other thing I was thinking about is how, in terms of art making and writing or sculpture and literature and so on, is how sometimes it seems to me as if sometimes it seems to me as if it might as well be the same thing, or there's a kind of writing with objects or writing with images, and other times it seems to me that it's a relationship of mutual aversion. So what often happens is that I will begin, I've said this in so many interviews to the point that I sometimes distrust it, because I'm like, is this just something I say? But I think it really is true that sometimes I'll think something's going to be a piece of writing, and I'll approach it as if it'll be a piece of writing, because I do things that are just writing, obviously, as well, and as mentioned. But and it turns out that I somehow can't articulate whatever it is in the form of writing, or it doesn't work, or I have the sense that it really doesn't work, and then it ends up being something that's actually more formal or more material or whatever. So in this case, I'd begun with an attempt to write something that was a quite baggy piece of writing, very kind of like, and I think that was the early sign that it maybe wasn't going to work in that form, as it was very fragmentary. I was going to just read you. So this was the text, that the Wheel of Fortune text that happened like before the show, that I abandoned in the process of, I was going to do them both alongside each other, and then it actually became, it turned out it made more sense to work with this kind of conceptual material in the form of an installation, I felt. I'm just going to read you a little bit from this, and as you can, I think you'll see why I thought it hadn't worked. So it's extremely fragmentary. It could have been different, but it was not. Types of creation myth: Oedipus, I love you, Mom. Electra, I love you, Dad. Divine twins, I love you. Impossible love is the engine. You're going to need those parts replaced. All of them. I wouldn't bother if I were you. The insurance value is lower than the repair costs, and yet. Types of apocalypse: death by fire, death by landslide, death by water, death by heat, death by cold, death by cash, paid in installments, pound of flesh, death by death. Spirits hang heavy in the air around me, hoping that I can guarantee their birth. It could have been different, but it was not. Basra, 750 AD. I am writing my book of cryptographic messages. In my little room, there is nothing but words. Sometimes I leave and fling a bird into the sky. I do this for money. The falcon can hear me from 10 miles away. Come home, I say, and wherever she is, she does. Feathers drifting downward give me an idea for how to notate vowels. Later, my head full of numbers, I walk headfirst into a pillar and die. Death, too, is like a little room full of diacritic marks without words, modulations of the unspoken. Come home, I say, to the sperm and the egg, and they make their way towards each other so that I can be reborn. It was not, but it could have been different. Europe is ash, mud, bones, lives, mornings, nights, childbirths, births of animals, deaths of children, deaths of animals. Mathematics is elsewhere. This is not relevant yet, by the way. But different could not have been it. Europe is cities, farms, the Irish question, the Jewish question, visa arrangements, marble floor, hardwood floor, tall window, naturalization papers. At school, they pour numbers into your head, and in the private recesses there, you bunch them together and smooth them out again, pile and scatter them. They hover brightly above the street where the faces of the citizenry are hostile and their police strut, suffused with new law. Wait, that's fine. That'll do. So that was a failed piece of writing that turned into this. So I think in that sense, I sometimes have the feeling that it's sometimes I use this analogy that I'm not even sure is true musically, but I feel like in songs where there's a saxophone and a voice, there's either the saxophone or the voice because they occupy the same kind of register. That may or may not be. I mean, I haven't researched if there's any exceptions to that or if that's actually a rule, but I have the sense that some types of sensation that kind of occupy the same place. So I think that's what I mean by mutual aversion, is in this case there was something about the process. The process of writing couldn't coexist or something, or it had to kind of happen in some other way. Another thing that happened to me while I was working on this show was I had a conversation with the gallerist Maxwell Graham, who is the gallerist and curator at Essex Street in New York City, and he said, why do you not make specific arguments in your art? He was like, you make very specific arguments in your critical work, and then it comes to making an installation, and you kind of don't make a specific argument. And I was like, that is true. I think in some ways I do go to art to kind of not make an argument exactly, or when I feel overwhelmed by the prospect of making an argument, and what I want to do is just kind of like make a sort of constellation in the hope that something will arise in between that constellation that will say more of what I meant than if I was doing it more through my own intention. But I see that's a kind of weakness or laziness or whatever. So actually after the conversation with Maxwell was when I added the boards with the police reports on them, because I thought I felt I wanted to, I mean, again, it's like, I don't know how specific it is, but I felt the idea of the light being kind of captured by some kind of institutional or repressive form was maybe closer to what I was trying to say about chance than the kind of original, more like nomic show that I had in mind. So basically, when I was thinking about the kind of, I mean, I'm sure that I actually haven't been able to listen to, I've only been able to listen to one of the previous discussions in the conference. I'm sure the concept of plottedness has come up a lot. That definitely, when I was trying to think about why it might be that in some ways, sometimes writing and art making feel like they can't occur within the same conceptual space, or they can't, there's something like radically different about them as ways of approaching a concept. Obviously, I only compare these things because they both exist in my life, so that's maybe not always necessary. But I guess I was thinking about plot in the sense of there's a kind of spatiality of sculpture or spatiality of installation where you kind of move through it. In some ways, I don't control so much about what happens there, or at least I mean, as I was saying earlier about control, I both do and don't control what happens in that sense. And then there's plot in terms of narrative, where I think there's a much more tight control of what happens, and it also has maybe more to do with the kind of temporal control. Obviously, there's a way that a written plot is also spatial, like it moves through conceptual space, but I think it's more to do with temporality. And then actually, so I was going to read to you one more thing that I had written in the failed writing before this show happened, because it ended up also being a kind of about a kind of plot. It ended up very narrative, like more than I usually write, like a kind of piece of fiction. And the piece of fiction was to do with a kind of plot against a casino, so a kind of plot against chance. I'm just going to read you part of this again. Anyway, thank you for your patience. She specialized in games where skill veils chance. The ban on indoor smoking in casinos had cut out a whole vocabulary of signs. Traditionally, the spotter would light a cigarette. Now she affected allergies and cat-like sneezes. Her talent for looking like nothing and no one at all made her gestures inconspicuous to the dealer. Even her co-conspirators had to watch her unusually closely. By commanding no one's attention, she commanded theirs. She had come on a long, complicated journey to be looked at without seeming to ask. The idea, as ever, was to make a lot of money with little effort and not go to jail. This idea frilled the edges of multiple class positions, making them fluffy and capable of touching. The spotter knew children of billionaires who ran casino scams because the father loved to gamble. She had friends who grew up on government cheese and were now lactose intolerant property owners in New York City. And so on. So that was kind of interesting to me, that a show that actually ended up pretty abstract in terms of its claims about chance, had as a kind of shadow side or a kind of another possible fate. It had this extremely plotted. I was very surprised to find myself writing like fiction in a more conventional sense, although that is something I've been moving towards more. So anyway, so I hope some of that was somewhat comprehensible. I know it's a little bit dense and I'm trying to get through a lot at once, but I guess, yeah, I suppose one take-home thing would be like a kind of like, I guess the sense of like plot as a kind of spatial arrangement versus plot as a kind of conspiracy or a kind of a temporal arrangement. But I'm sure that has come up because it seems like such an irresistible concept for something talking about both sculpture and literature. Yeah, and I was thinking actually in that vein, I was thinking about how literature that sacrifices its control of temporality, you know, if you think of like B.S. Johnson or someone like that, where there's a kind of sacrifice of the usual authorial control of how the text is sequenced, I think that becomes sculptural. I'd say that's the join for me at where literature would become sculpture, would be where you no longer make an assertion about the order in which people would read it. And then I was wondering if that would even apply to like the kind of choose your own adventure kind of model, but I mean, I guess you could even make an argument for that, but whatever. So that's Wheel of Fortune. It's just, yes. Okay, so this is another show that I did just pre-pandemic, February 2020, a momentous time. But it's called Ruin Rien. This is very much thinking about writing as material. So it was a kind of, this almost began as a play with the idea of artist research. I have a somewhat, I don't really have any real research training. I think I have sort of academic tendencies that I've never successfully actualized or whatever. So I tend to, my research is pretty haphazard, and it's often will begin with just reading a bunch of Wikipedia pages and then trying to like get deeper into things after that. So literally in some of these, if you see the like heads of the, what you call it, the kind of stags heads or whatever, then they have like Wikipedia and other kind of internet pages like printed out internet pages like stuck on them. And then the other, this is Ruin Rien is, again, way too, the ideas in these shows are often pretty densely packed, which I think is another way it has a kind of like I wouldn't, I think there's something about how it relates to writing, how my work is based in writing that comes out in how sort of conceptually dense I intend the things to be, which is always a kind of risk or gamble that maybe it doesn't entirely come across. But I like the idea that if you keep thinking about it, it will keep revealing new layers of thought. Because so this was based around a kind of an anecdote or a story about the storming of the Bastille early in the French Revolution, and as some of you probably know, the Marquis de Sade was in the Bastille until just a few days before, and then he was annoying everyone because he was a very intense person. So they moved him to a mental hospital instead. So he just left when they stormed the Bastille, and he was very upset to be moved because he'd been working on 120 Days of Sodom, his famous book about this kind of like sort of various like intense sort of sadistic sexual acts and so on, and he'd been working on that kind of obsessively, actually I think in the form of a scroll, and which maybe like suits the obsessive writer more, and he'd like stuffed it into the brick. So before he was taken to a mental hospital, he stuffed the manuscript into the bricks of his cell. So that was one of the strands I was thinking about, was that. And as you can see, this is a pretty almost one-to-one but kind of somewhat playful reiteration of that. Clearly this is not, I mean, that page is torn from the published copy of 120 Days of Sodom, and they're between conventional bricks that are blocking out the light from a window. But and then the other thing I was interested in was which is another kind of like fairly minor story from the time of the French Revolution, was that the King of France was he kept a diary, and on the day of the storming of the Bastille, he wrote the word rien, nothing, in his diary. And this has been interpreted in various ways, like the distance of the ruling class from the people and so on. But then from reading about it, it seemed like the most common interpretation was that he mainly kept it as a hunting diary, and that what nothing, rien, meant in this case was that he hadn't killed anything that day. So there's a kind of strand throughout the show. I kind of made a copy of this Ed Ruscha painting that says "oof," which is a kind of like sort of like in that painting, in the original context of the Ruscha painting, is meant as a kind of non-signifying word. So I offer the nothingness of the king's statement as a kind of non-signification, and then the other strand is just these fake antlers from the fake stag's head. There's a fake, I don't have a better picture of this. There's a fake, oh yeah, so here are the antlers, and they have almost like thought bubbles of the Wikipedia pages and the other kind of research pages that are to do with different, there's like an anecdote about like how Ed Ruscha lived around the corner from Napoleon's like great grandson or something, who taught him how to draw. There was some really weird, as I think as probably always happens when you're doing research, you always get these weird additional resonances, or kind of erratic extra resonances. So that happened. So I stuck some of those on these, and then this is like a fake kind of bear rug, and fake sheepskin, and I kind of added eyes, and this kind of like ad for a cake mix called Vegan Knife. So there was a kind of like playful take on the idea of nothing as like no dead animals today, kind of. And then I guess this was thinking about the relationship between, like, just thinking about Desaad and like the kind of idea of a kind of anarchic desire versus a kind of controlled and sort of appropriate desire. And this is again a pretty like playful piece that I actually love, but like, like other people find underwhelming. But The Rules is a very famous, as you probably know, dating guide about how to get a husband, and I just slightly altered the it's pretty intense advice, and I kind of added so it's like now the ruler instead. So and then this was the other element in the show, which is this is one of my favorite books. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, and it's kind of was a kind of about how the Haitian Revolution kind of comes in and sort of completes the French Revolution. But and I added this thing saying ruin to kind of think about the ways that the kind of the slave revolt or the black revolt or the kind of lumpen revolt almost kind of gets read as ruin rather than as kind of correctly about politics. So this was meant as a kind of exteriority of politics, as I think most of the show might be. There's more Vegan Knife. I put googly eyes on the top of the sheepskin. That's the painting again. Okay, that's the next thing. So there was also a video in the show where I tried to like, which was actually really texty. As you can see on this, it just was like a kind of sea ocean image, and it said, the line visible here as I think about ruin a lot lately, and this was me kind of going over some probably one of the things I'm like best known for, unfortunately, which was a kind of 2017 embarrassing kind of media scandal around this controversy to do the Whitney biennial. I'm not super into talking about it, so please don't ask me any questions about it, but I kind of yeah, I think that this video was kind of reflecting on that as a kind of because the structure of a sort of political claim made through the lens of blackness being experienced by art world people as if it was completely destructive and ruinous, rather than as something that came from within the same like discursive sphere, was kind of interesting to me. So that was like part of what I was trying to do with that kind of Haitian Revolution versus French Revolution. Anyway, so in terms of this show, I think it it almost is a piece, I feel like the show almost is a piece of writing, as you can see as I speak about it. There's a kind of illustrative quality to the works, although I tried to make them also kind of pleasurable. I guess the use of humor was a way to kind of make a case for the somewhat illustrative quality, because that always feels like a bit of a kind of banned category or something. So I was, yeah, and I was really, but I think I'm using kind of argumentation again as a kind of textural material. So then the way the Wikipedia pages are a material, and the concepts, I think, yeah, so I think it's like, and I thought about how one of the interests of this exhibition was about how desire is a form of complicity. I mean, in the case of the ruler, or even of like de Sade, who's kind of from this aristocratic position. In some ways, he was in like the furthest left wing part of the mountain of like the revolutionary parliament. He was really far, he was very far to the left, but there's a way that because he comes from a kind of aristocratic position, maybe people who read the Peter Weiss or seen the Peter Weiss play Marat Sade would maybe be more familiar with what I'm talking about. But in some ways, he's someone whose politics are about a kind of anarchy of desire, and it's not really clear what they might have to do with an actual social transformation or kind of proletarian struggle. This kind of weird like convergence between the kind of anarchy of aristocratic desire and something that maybe comes up from a kind of like proletarian or even lumpen position. So I was thinking about desire as kind of complicity. I mean, I don't think complicity is a super interesting question, to be honest, but I guess I do find it interesting at the level of desire, because it's one of the ways we get really, I guess it's a kind of cruel optimism form on that level. I mean, political complicity seems a little tedious to think about, in the sense that's the ground, that's just where you start. But I thought, but in terms of like thinking about that and thinking about writing and art making and sculpture and this, I thought about how there's this very well-known like Frank Wilderson, obviously a famous like Afro-pessimist. There's a pretty well-known observation that he makes where he says there's kind of, I think, really key to his entire thought, which is he says as an activist and a political organizer, which he was for a long time, he can't say he wants the world to end. Like you have to kind of work constructively and positively. And he's like, but even though you think the world is, you might have an extremely negative image of the world from doing that kind of work that might lead you to have quite destructive feelings towards it. And so he says he goes to writing to express the desire for the world to end, because that's something that's not allowed in the sphere of official politics or official organizing. And I thought about how maybe I go to this, there's something about this type of work where I go into this to kind of express a desire for kind of the end of however written this down is like to express a desire for the end of the law of language. But now I come to say it out loud to you, that feels a bit too grand a claim, but I think that's something. But I think what that did bring me to is the idea that there's a kind of destructiveness. There's using writing as material is a kind of destructiveness towards writing that I think is more explicit in the Chisenhell show that Nick mentioned. That I'm actually, oh yeah, I do have some pictures of it. Sorry, they're in the wrong order. So this, I'm sorry, I don't have many good pictures of this, but it was, yeah, as Nick mentioned, it was a pile of, I mean, I had to include this just because it's a very literally literature as sculpture kind of, so it's just like, this is irresistible. Again, this was, I mean, it's funny that, this was again, actually, this was 2018, it was pretty soon after the kind of, I became kind of virally notorious for a moment, so I guess it was also like the 2017 thing I mentioned, so I guess that was also, which unfortunately ended up pretty like defining, even though I don't really know how to place it in my general interests or whatever, but like, yeah, so this was, I guess, a kind of plea for the creative power of destruction or something, or the kind of, a kind of generative power of critique or destruction. So I kind of made these, this book of transcripts, conversations with friends. The conversations were just that I sat down with friends and I asked them what was the situation, and they all answered completely differently according to their sense of what a situation might be. One person talked about the kind of, the situation of like 500 years of capitalism. Another person talked about an assault that she'd experienced and the kind of aftermath of that. Like they're all really different, and they're kind of, and I tried to use the editing method of censorship, which was a kind of gag about like whatever. Anyway, so I tried to use, it was like censorship as an editing method or whatever that, I could probably say, I mean, whatever, I could probably say more about that later. So and then there was, I mean, as you can just about see, I think in the background, there's these black objects. Those are shredders. So the idea was that people could, and there's also shredded copies of the book on the floor. So the idea was that people could either take a book or shred a book or do whatever. It was kind of, I was trying to, again, it's this kind of controlling, not controlling thing, where it's like, do what you will with this book of kind of somewhat only very kind of lightly edited conversations. The white and red objects are kind of teddy bears, and they're stuffed with, my biggest regret about this show is I don't think I made this clear enough. I was too subtle, but they're also stuffed with the shredded books. So I think I was trying to say that the idea that it kind of through a sort of process of like critique or destruction or whatever, you could, like, new kind of positions are kind of formed or whatever, or new that a new kind of fullnesses or new forms of being might come out of a kind of process of destruction. And more of the situation. So, and this one just hangs uselessly because it's not been filled with the destroyed text. It is, yeah, I do love, it's cool that Nick mentioned about transitional objects. These are called transitional objects. I mean, partly just because they're teddies, it's a classic transitional object for a child. I've more recently come to understand that Lacan wrote to Winnicott and said, your transitional object is my objet petit a. I wish I had better Lacan graphs to kind of be able to kind of explicate all the way, or think through. I think I'm still just sort of like, would like to kind of begin the process of thinking through all the implications of that, because in some ways Winnicott is really interesting as an analyst, and I feel that he's not so attentive to, I mean, Lacan's so attentive to language and the specifics of the language of the analysand, whereas Winnicott is so interested in their gesture, and they're kind of like, he's so interested in like the physical body. So there's a beautiful part in his book, Holding and Interpretation. I love the title because it's so hard to say, but he talks about this analysand sort of like leans forward and he's on the couch. Winnicott thought the couch was important, not because it kind of produced this untrammeled language, but that he said it was the closest that you could come to the analyst, like holding the patient in their arms. And so there's this moment in Holding and Interpretation where he kind of like, the patient or the analysand leans forward, and somehow in this gesture Winnicott understands that there's a medium between them, that they're an amniotic sac or a kind of amniotic fluid has sprung up between them, and they're now like bound together by it. And so that's why they're able to, now they can finally like really get into it in terms of the analysis. It would take too long for me to try and say all the ways I feel like that relates to I feel like maybe there's something a bit like I still feel I don't think I'm ready yet to kind of fully articulate the ways that relates to kind of the kind of relationship between language and Lacan and the body, and Winnicott relates to kind of what's happening with writing and objects in my work, but I think there's some desire for it to have something to do with it or something. So anyway, and then so this brings me to, there's too much, so you know a bit where we are in time, and I can also like skip one of these if we are really not doing good for time, but I have two more shows I wanted to just briefly talk about. I'm sorry, I'm very content heavy. It's not always the best. I just tuned into this panel before and someone was saying like, maybe we should just talk about one sculpture. And I was like, that probably would be really much more interesting if I would just stick to one thing. But I guess I had so many, I felt like all these shows kind of did have different ways of thinking about the relationship between objects and writing and so on. So it was kind of irresistible to give you a kind of broader overview, but obviously maybe if anyone has questions, we could zoom in more to some detail of it. And so I'd begun with this. So this show, the Chisenhall show, kind of began a new approach for me. And this is something that another thing I thought about in terms of like plot and sculpture and literature and writing and argumentation and writing as material and so on, was I thought about characters and going back to the thing I said earlier about the development of Christianity, the popularity of Christianity as a kind of repudiation of the image of fate in astrology. There's a way in, I was briefly at film school before I went to art school. I dropped out after 6 months because I didn't like it, which I'm sometimes like, wow, that probably would have been a much easier life. Yeah, they one of the really standard like screenwriting kind of codes or kind of how would you say that? Kind of like the logic of screenwriting is that plot is character. So you take a character, I mean, this is in a really classical sense, you take a character who, for example, like a character who, you know, all they care about is their family, and then you put them in a situation where they're separated from their family and so on. And then you have like Tom Cruise in the War of the Worlds or like whatever it is. So working on these transcripts for the book, where I had these very in-depth conversations with friends, kind of I think generated a kind of new aspect of my work, where I started doing these videos where the main substance of the video was these kind of like more in-depth kind of character studies, where I would get people to talk to me for about, like, I do like 3 or 4 hour interviews on particular topics, and then I would kind of use those to kind of produce a kind of basis for making both the spatial arrangement and some objects. So I was going to ask Nick to show 4 minutes of this video, but maybe if we don't have enough time, you could just show a couple of minutes. But and then this is the context that the videos were shown in. So maybe we can just watch.
Sure.
Everybody was a person. No one was an animal. No one was anything other than a person. They were prescribed a role, and that role was to create an environment for which that phantom could like float around and kind of disturb things, right? You know, go in and cause trouble.
But yeah, it was cut. You actually cut the film by hand.
So it felt very real.
She used 2 moviolas, and she would be like, you know, her hands would be like this, and she just, yeah, she was very fast with it.
How many people play the Phantom?
In total, it's got to be around 9 people. Around 9 people.
Sort of like when you're looking at something with no sound and you don't hear, you see like things that maybe the dialogue or something will distract you from.
There you go. Perfect.
I've even heard of a story of like someone falling from the top of the structure onto this thing. Like, it's weird how people can get hurt by the Phantom, and it's
I don't think
energetic.
she really wanted me to compete in her field. People always say, why didn't you become an editor? It was like too hot to handle for me.
No, you worked just enough to get the story to be projected. They inner work you hard, maybe, even though it's easy, but there's an inner working of things that needs a lot of attention, a lot of specific attention. Like,
Hannah, I don't know if that's a cruel place to stop it, but
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that seems fine. It's just so you get the, I mean, yeah, it's just so you get the vague idea. So, and I'm going to show it. Yeah. Okay. So this was a kind of, this had this kind of like quite complicated in my head, kind of like 3-part structure where there was a performer, an editor, and a frame. The performer was Raymond, the person in the video who's talking about. He was a performer in the Phantom of the Opera on Broadway, and he talks about this extremely intricate structure where there's like 9 different people who are playing the part of the Phantom, and some of them appear at some part, like, you know, because there's so many costume changes and different things. So he talks about that. And then there's the edit is this woman who you see in the video, Raimi, and she talks about her mother, who was a pretty famous Hollywood editor called Dee Allen. I wanted someone who was an editor but at one remove. I tried to kind of have everything at some, so like apart from Raymond, who like is a performer and talks about his performance, talking about his performance, everyone else is kind of removed. So like Raimi is the daughter of this famous editor who's dead now, and she talks about her and their relationship and so on. She was actually extremely forthcoming and talked about pretty strikingly personal stuff, which was amazing. And then the other video that you see here, where it's just subtitles, there's no sound, was a conversation you see me have on the phone, again, like even more removed, to this guy, Clemens von Redemeyer, who's an artist who'd previously done a show in the same space. And his show was about the history of the building. And during the Nazi period, it was a speech and language institute run by David Zwirner's grandfather. So it was like a weird just texture or whatever. Like, it wasn't really clear how, like, apart from that he obviously was working with the Nazi government, it's not clear how like egregiously Nazi it was. I think it was like, there's some stuff that was pretty, maybe would not meet today's ethical standards like they did. And the really striking thing was that they made like X-ray videos of people speaking so that they could see all the kind of like bones moving and so on. And I thought that was really interesting in the sense of like a video that has a destructive effect on the person who's speaking, because obviously the X-ray video is extremely toxic. Like you wouldn't do it now because it's like too radioactive. So I guess I was, in terms of like doing these very in-depth interviews with people who are making themselves quite vulnerable to me by speaking with me, I thought about the kind of potentially toxic power of video or whatever. So and then, as you can see, I hope the chandelier was just original to the beautiful building. You can see to the right there's this kind of middle right, there's this grid-like structure, kind of like a Solowit-esque or whatever thing that was just made of wood. And I think that was like a kind of that was yeah, so this this is a really like literal kind of almost one-to-one relationship between like, yeah, like a kind of plottedness or form that emerges from character and narrative or something. I thought, so they were named after but they're named after the kind of like means of representation of all the people. So they were named after either majestic, these grid sculptures. One of them was called Majestic, which is the name of the theatre that the Phantom of the Opera has been in for like 30 something years. Another was named Moviola, which is the name of the machine that Didi Allen would use to edit. And then it also had some other wooden elements that were called Kunstverein Braunschweig, which was like the kind of means of expression of me and Clemens or whatever. Yeah, and the video is just repeated throughout, and then there would be these grid structures throughout. So and in one way, I think I've not this. Yeah, this is like, these are like meant to evoke contracts, where I just signed both the names on both sides. This, you can barely see it, but this is the Kunstverein Braunschweig thing. It's like wooden. You can just about make out around the door. It's very distracting because of the beautiful light in the next room, but there's these kind of like wooden sticks that I attached to the wall. So that was meant to kind of like evoke the ways that the gallery itself was a kind of structure, a structure of representation. And again, here you see it to the right of the video of Raymond, you see, and there's two edits. There's like a Raymond Ramey and a Ramey Raymond, and the Raymond one like foregrounds Raymond a lot more. Yeah, so I think that's basically it. I think it was just the idea that of a kind of, it was pretty like structural. Like I think it was an attempt to sort of take a pretty like thick kind of lived material, like a lot of density. I mean, it's not, because it's not just people. I mean, like Raymond's not just talking about the performance, he talks about his experience of doing it, of the other performers, like the kind of various like as you saw in even in that little segment, ways it could be physically damaging to the performers. Raimi talks not only about her mother, but also about her relationship with her mother's relationship with her own mother. So there's like a generational dimensions. And then obviously in the interview with Clemens, it's like about his experience of doing a show there 5 years previously. It takes up various like historical threads of you know, like whatever, the kind of history of Germany and so on, and like our different relationships to that. So I guess I was taking a lot of like pretty like thick material and trying to sort of like treat it pretty structurally. And I think the grid sculptures were, and I actually wish I'd had, the grid sculptures were an attempt to sort of like think about, or to kind of reference that, or to think about that as a kind of capture or a kind of structuring. And there's, unfortunately, I don't think I have the picture of, I wanted to show you a picture of the, one of the works is two grid sculptures, both kind of broken and like fused into each other, sort of shattered, and it's just sort of a pile of like bits and pieces, and that's like Majestic / Moviola. So I guess it was the idea that there was some possibility of all the regimes of perception or the forms of representation kind of colliding in some way. And the other thing that was interesting about this in terms of the impossibility of using things structurally that are in fact about flesh and blood and experience, or whatever, kind of how difficult it is to actually like reduce things to a line, was that one of my initial editing logic for the video was like, okay, Raimi is going to edit Raymond. So the Raimi footage, the woman in the video is going to edit the footage of Raymond, and that just became basically, I mean, so one of the things that happens is in the video you just saw a couple of minutes of, her story about her mother, a story about her mother and her grandmother kind of ends up just sort of almost like overtaking Raymond's observations of the Phantom of the Opera experience, and in the other one you just hear Raimi's voice kind of interrupting Raymond. So those are my two attempts to kind of like use Raimi to edit Raymond, but of course it was a kind of impossible, I'd set myself an impossible task because that's, you know, they're two people kind of, yeah, so those are some thoughts I had about, hopefully that was some food for thought, and I'm going to not talk about the last thing because I think we're running out of time.
And that was amazing, Hannah. It was so rich, and I know you invited us to sort of help you zoom into particular objects, but I actually want to start the questions by sort of zooming out, because you kind of leave us there with another kind of intensity or density, all of these overlapping layers, and density seemed to come up a couple of times as one way that you were connecting some thoughts about sculpture or object arrangement in exhibition making and literature, and all this way of sort of tying together tensions. I just wondered, so first question is really, that density seems to be like a real signature of both the way you make exhibitions, like there's lots of stuff going on, pulling in lots of directions, but also when you read us that little bit of new writing that you described as failed, that disjunctive quality seemed to similarly have that sort of power of density. So is that like a stylistic thing that you're really attracted to? And like, what do you think that means for your readers and viewers?
It's something I have to work against in my writing, and in my writing I think I know more how to do it. So I have a like little novella coming out hopefully by the end of the year, but like, and in that I really kind of like tried to deal with that by, because it was pretty dense. It's pretty dense, but I've tried to do like relatively short declarative sentences to try and like match. So like the actual like structure, the syntax is pretty clear, but then the ideas are maybe complicated. That's something I try and aim for in writing. I think in terms of how I try and do that in the exhibitions, I do think about it somewhat narratively. Like I think about the order in which you might encounter things and the kind of placement of the things in the room. But I think in some cases there is just a kind of like almost helpless density that happens in the exhibitions. I think yeah, I mean, sorry, I must get out of the habit of thinking about things so negatively, but I do think it's a kind of weakness, but I think it's like a sort of it's like, I hope it's a sort of like likable weakness or whatever. I think I sometimes can't choose, or I can't choose what my position is, so I want to just present all. It's kind of like, if I wanted to aggrandize this, I'd be like, it's somewhat cubist in the sense like every possible take on the argument is available. Something people often people who've read my like art criticism or my book reviews or my more sort of like political kind of work are often really surprised to meet me, because apparently and someone once said like, recently, I'm so haunted by this guy was like, you're so different than your writing, and I was like, how am I different from my writing? And he said, you seem so much less sure. And I was like, I think that is a sort of and then I felt it was kind of almost like I mean, maybe defensively, I was like, I felt that was a kind of deliberate, there's a kind of ethics of that. It's like, I'm not sure. I spend a lot of time when I'm writing something that involves a sort of like thinking through a kind of political or social situation. I think about it for a long time, and I do try and like construct a pretty like solid argument that comes not just from like me sitting and tapping it out at my laptop, but actually like a huge amount of thought and talking to people and like considering reading and so on. Whereas and so I feel like I'd rather be less sure in real life but sure in my writing, and I feel like there's something maybe almost like liberal in a pejorative sense about being really sure in real life and then seeing everything from both sides in your writing or whatever. So I think yeah, so I don't know. So I think sometimes there's a kind of way that art making as a space of like not being, I do treat it a little bit as a space of not being sure. And I think one of the things that was really is interesting for me about this conversation that I mentioned that I had with Maxwell about doing more precise argumentation in my exhibitions is I am actually excited, like moving forward for maybe the next show, to actually kind of think about what it would mean to use art not as a space of like relative uncertainty or as a space where you can have every possible position, but to kind of try and do more what I try and do in writing and construct something that's more of a specific argument or whatever. I mean, as you can see from how I talk, I'm constantly shuttling back, and even though in some ways I could think of like writing and art as actually pretty like braided together at this point in my career or whatever, I think they do somehow, I somehow maintain them as like separate spaces so that I can have like one can be almost like a runoff from the other. I have painter friends who'll run like several canvases at once, like they'll have like 5 different canvases, and it's like one is like the stupid canvas where you put all your stupid idea, and like, and I do sort of relate to that in terms of I'll generally have like several projects at any one time, and some are writing and some are art and like whatever. But yeah, I think the density thing is just it's sort of it's a habit, it's kind of a habitual, like, yeah.
Well, I wonder if we can flip it over, because one of the questions that's come up here is whether you see your audiences as viewers or readers when they come into the kind of show where language is so important, but objects and space are the thing that they're moving through.
That's such an interesting question. I mean, I guess both. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I think I'm not very in a way that I don't think I'm not extremely, and I think I could justify this. I feel like I'm not. I think it's like Task of the Translator by Walter Benjamin that kind of begins with this thing about how you can't think of art from the point of view of its reception. I don't really, and who else have I read this in? I feel like I come across this in different contexts. I feel like I just read shit, no, I don't remember, but I feel like I've seen other artists kind of talk about this. I don't think I have a very active understanding of what my audience is or what they're doing. I think my hope is that if it's if the work, again, and this maybe is a kind of density, if the work is like of enough kind of like thought and kind of thought and effort to kind of like think has gone into the work, that will somehow do something for someone. Like I don't feel a lot of capacity to determine, which is maybe why the control versus not control comes up, is I'm not really sure about how I would think about what an audience, what someone who's like a viewer or reader of my work, how they should experience it. I mean, I do think there's a kind of funny thing about contemporary art. I don't know, I mean, maybe obviously everyone has different habits and practices when they go and see art, but I think often you walk into the gallery and you pick up a piece of paper. So something that happened, I mean, this is such a micro detail, but one of the things I really would have liked for the Braunschweig show with the grid and the Phantom of the Opera thing, I would have kind of liked it if you didn't know what anyone was talking about. Like, I kind of loved it. I'm sort of still really like, maybe that's also like why I sometimes show it in these contexts where it's less clear, because I think it might be a more engaging experience to not really know what anyone is talking about. But obviously, because you have to produce all this literature just as part of the like architecture of the, it's like you need your like press release and you need your whatever. So then people just like know too much when they come in, and that's how I consume art as well. Like I'll like read the labels and I read the press release and I read all the things, and but I guess, yeah, I don't know. Sorry, that was a bit random.
It was a really good answer, and actually it makes a shift that I was hoping we'd make, which is to talk maybe a little bit, if you're comfortable doing it, about this new fictional writing that you're doing, because I just wonder, in these plots or these, I think you describe them as more conventionally fiction-like writing, in that kind of space of composition, where you can kind of let go of some of that architecture that pre-codes the experience, the explanatory preface kind of thing. Do you find yourself sort of, I don't want to use the word freer, because I'm not sure that that's the right one, but do you feel freer when writing that more kind of,
I mean, I like love writing. I like love writing in a way I don't love making art. And I think one of the things I find really interesting about making art is it's like hard, it's like work in a way that like I think at this point, I mean, whatever, I mean, obviously it's partly a tasting. At this point, I feel like I've got, a couple of years ago, I was like, I think with the Braunschweig show, I was like, I've kind of accidentally got kind of good at making exhibitions, where I have a sense of what I'm doing when I'm making exhibitions. But I'm the type, I've been writing since I can't remember. I mean, I have a much more sort of in a sense like I sometimes think if I wanted to be consummate, if I wanted to be virtuosic, I probably would just do writing, or I'd just try and like develop a kind of virtuosity in writing. And I think there's something where I'm a bit resistant to that idea. I don't want to be virtuosic, which maybe I'm now trying to undo. And obviously, not that because it's actually just obviously it's really hard. Fiction's really hard. And I would love to be like I'd love to. I mean, obviously, like the peak era of fiction is like, you know, there's so many amazing things from like 19th century, early 20th century, and so on. And it's like so yeah, I'd love to be like Balzac or whatever, where it's like every single character you have like their bank account details and like everything about their entire like, you know, like whatever. But at the moment I'm still the novel that's coming out is still, I mean, I think it's really in the realm of like an artist book, not only because it's coming out with an artist book publisher with Capricious in New York, but it's very like artist writing in that sense. It hasn't been edited to the same degree a conventional novel would be, and it's also kind of like a retelling of the first 6 months of 2020. I'm dimly aware no one really wants to revisit this, so it has a kind of like it has a sort of additional sci-fi thing where there's also an alien invasion, and that's how I've tried to make it a little bit more palatable. So it's a fairly goofy novella it's only about like 20 something thousand words. It's like these two characters, it's like one character is a social democrat and the other one's an insurrectionist, and they're a couple, and then they get separated by the pandemic, and then they come together at the end when the only serious departure from reality apart from the alien invasion, which is almost just an overlay, because I realized while doing readings or whatever that people like it's actually like really stressful to just revisit the kind of early COVID disaster feeling. So it's like if every few sentences it says something about aliens, it somehow like takes down some of the like stress of it. I mean, it's a pretty like whatever. So I alienated the experience a little, but like the other big departure from reality is that in the book the kind of May-June kind of revolt is successful and leads to the establishment of the New York Commune or whatever. So I guess that's like the social democrat and the insurrectionists come together in the Commune to like reestablish a new society or whatever. So it's pretty schematic, it's pretty goofy and pretty like episodic kind of, but I think I'm trying to move towards, I feel like I've done a big detour to, I think I sometimes think about my I mean, I do feel engaged. More and more as I'm doing art for longer, I feel less like I don't want to stay in the kind of bratty rejection of contemporary art. And I am, you know, the art, I think it's also because of living in New York, where I think there is a sort of pretty, I think people are more interested in like objects in a weird way, or at least than what I was accustomed to from being at Goldsmiths in London and so on. People are like, I've made a beautiful object. I'm like, wow, you have. So I kind of feel like the sort of, I don't want to be bratty in relation to art. Nevertheless, and I do find art interesting, but nevertheless, I sometimes think that the trajectory of my work is that I just wanted to write without any, I wanted to write with total freedom. I wanted to write with total freedom. Now I can publish, it's only as an artist. You could never publish the kind of stuff I publish. You could never publish a novella like that. I mean, you could probably do it in a kind of zine format or with your friends, like imprint or whatever, but you kind of need art spaces almost to write in a way that's like completely like untrammeled or whatever. So I think what I wanted from art was to be able to write however I liked. And now I do, but now I think I want to come back to like writing in a way that's more structured and has more fidelity to convention. But I mean, who knows if that turns out to be possible. It's really, and it's like stimulatingly hard. It's definitely hard.
that ties really nicely to a question that's come in here, which I hope I'm going to ventriloquize well, but it's about the critical rhythm between the writing you do and the making you do. So like one of my first experiences of your work was effectively you as an art critic. So you writing critically in a way that's very much about the experience of the work you're writing to or for or with. And so I guess the question here is whether there's ever like a critical way in which you write about your own work, an overtly critical way, or vice versa, whether the art making is ever kind of directly critical of what you're trying to construct in the writing.
I do try, there's almost like a kind of like ethics of that where I try, okay, firstly, I think it would feel, I think just literally on a purely social level, like people find it annoying. So I feel like there was one time in a piece I wrote for Texas a Kunst a few years ago where I kind of like mentioned my own, like pretty late on into the piece, which is mainly about like, God, I don't remember now, but like the internet and so on. Like it kind of, I say something about my own work, and I remember someone being like, oh, that's kind of like, I think there's some weird like etiquette around it that means I try and be a little bit careful with it. I don't think I have total insight. I mean, I think this is kind of screwed up because I wonder, am I like deliberately like, am I deliberately cutting off some part of my intellect in order to kind of like have this kind of like this slightly dumb relationship, like that? Yeah, in the sense of like art is where I go to like not make an argument or to be stupid and some, or to kind of like not use language, or to use language in a way that's destructive or like whatever it is. So I don't think I would feel that competent to write critically about my work. I don't think, I'm sometimes really, I mean, it was in that conversation that you mentioned in Art Monthly, I think with Lana, I remember just like kind of basic things, like she was like, these are the colors you use, and I was like, oh, I don't think I'd like registered that those are my colors. I mean, it's a disgusting palette, which I think is partly because I'm kind of resistant to being too seductive or too much aiming towards something pleasurable for some reason. But like I read ages ago that brown paintings are the least popular, and then I sort of just use a lot of brown because I'm like I don't know, but like I think it's much easier to see other people's thing than it is to see your own thing. So in the same way that I might be able to analyze all the problems in my friends' lives and relationships and so on, but I'm completely unaware of my own. I think there's a lot of like blind spots in terms of what I'm doing, and that's almost like the hope is that someone could see more than you'd intended. On the other hand, because I do have this like, you know, because I'm like a more maybe I'm on the like more capable end. And I mean, there's a lot of amazing artists, writers, but I think I'm on the more sort of like academic-y, I sound more sort of like cerebral kind of end of that, even though obviously, as you can tell, I'm actually in person a little like hectic and uncertain, but like but I sound more cerebral. So often I think what happens, like for example, Harry Burke wrote a review of my the Arcadia Mesa show, the Rien Rien show, where he did just ventriloquize my account of what the show was, and I was like very grateful for the review, and I was like, that's very kind of you. I don't know if the show did actually successfully do that. I think no one really does. The problem is no one really does technically art criticism now. I think it would be so I mean occasionally, but I feel like it's relatively rare anyone would say like this doesn't work or it's not good. I mean, it's like, or you have to like catch, that's not really true, but you know what I mean. I think there's a lot of kind of like boosterism, so maybe that's not realistic, but I did wonder what would happen if someone didn't like read my text and be like, oh, this must be true. With students, like when I teach art, I'm pretty hard on students who say, I don't mind how people see the work. Like I'm just like, you have to, which is like not the same as the thing I'm saying of like, I don't know how people perceive it, but I think in the sense of like, I don't mind how people see it. It's more like if people say like, it just means, sorry, because I'm contradicting myself now. What I mean is like, if people say like, well, the work just means whatever people think it means or whatever, like I don't think that. I mean, I would hope it means hopefully some additional stuff that isn't what I put in there, but I'd hope it kind of like mainly or centrally or is anchored in some intended meaning that I had for it. And I don't know if that always, I think sometimes I use language to kind of like overly control that, or yeah.
That's a really nice bridge, because there's a pivot in some of the questions here, which is which moves toward the sort of dialogue in the videos. I guess that's one of the most expressed ways that we've seen in this presentation of the language coming to the foreground. And the question here is about the way in the snippet we saw there, how you made editorial decisions about where the voices came in and came over each other, and in a sense, like what tension in post-production you were creating as a dialogue between these two voices who didn't seem to be in the same room at the same time when shooting.
Yeah, partly because, okay, so Dee Dee Allen, the editor who's Raimi's mother, she was like she was the first editor to have like an above the line credit. Prior to Dee Dee Allen, at least this is what Raimi says, and I have not fact checked it, but it sounds very convincing. She edited like Bonnie and Clyde, Dog Day Afternoon, I should remember some more, The Addams Family. She's a very successful editor, and so prior to Dee Dee Allen's like era, at least, an editor was like a craftsperson almost, who would just kind of, the other thing I could have talked about but I didn't get to was just like the relationship between editing and writing, because I think actually video editing is, I hate shooting. I actually hate shooting footage. I find it really stressful, and then because you have to get so many things right or whatever, and it matters if you have successfully recorded the audio or not and so on. But like I love editing, like, because I'm like, oh, and now we're basically, it's like in the same way that when you write, you have language and then you have to like assemble it. When you edit video footage, you have all the footage you have and then you have to assemble it. So I'm really interested in editing. So Dee Dee Allen was like the first editor who, editing was previously like a craft discipline where you would kind of have you'd be like, first you have your establishing shot, then you have this close-up, then you have that close-up. It was pretty regulated kind of, and Dee Allen started to completely screw around with that and would kind of do things where she would like even like slightly alter the script. She would like start a scene like halfway through an action. She would, and one of the big things she did that she kind of innovated was I don't know how you say, it's like non-diegetic sound or something, but like she would like so you'd kind of hear, so you'd hear the sound from the next scene over the top of the or vice versa. Like you'd still like, I don't know, you'd sort of like, you're still looking at a house and then you hear the like you hear like the rumble of wheels and then you like see the wheels or whatever. So like the sound comes before the picture. So so because that's such a big part of her like innovation, I was like, oh, I'm gonna like play with this in the and at some point in the video Raimi says that. So a lot of what's being played with is just like the idea that like sound can, like that somehow Dee Allen has like freed up cinema to kind of like totally dislocate these two. I mean, there's other people who are doing that. It's not like she's the only person who did that, but I think she's become very heavily associated with that. So so I was really interested in that. That's one of the reasons. And then other than that, it's kind of it's pretty intuitive, and it's kind of just to do with kind of the moments of like interweaving, I felt there were between the completely different experiences. So there's moments where so you know, like I can't remember if it's in that part, but like Raymond's like it's like they've been related all along, and then you go into like Raimi talking about this like these intricate kind of family relationships or whatever. I think it was like I think I wanted it to edit it in such a way that they sort of like seem to kind of like echo back and forth between and kind of evoke each other's experiences without being similar. And that was kind of like what I meant by the grid. Like there was some way that through imposing the structure of the edit, I can kind of make them be the same in ways that are not actually the same. They come from totally different experiences, and they're talking about totally different relationships to performance or footage or film or whatever, which is in the end the main object, I guess.
But just one more question while we're around the subject. It was something I noticed when you were showing the slides of the very recent show, the Zurich show, was or were some motifs that I'm pretty sure I've seen your work before, like the kind of smiley face cut throughs and stuff like that. Yeah. And is that a kind of, do you find yourself sort of returning to certain motifs and bringing things back in as objects as that work in the installations, or is that something? I've done that.
Yeah. That's literally from the next thing I was going to show you, which is from a piece I did for the Sharjah Biennial, like in 2018. That was a collaboration, and then I like reintroduced one of the sculptures from that. And yeah, that was the first kind of callback thing like that I've done, and it was just because I was using it was a development of that. In some ways, the wheel with the light going through the wheel was like a development of the reverse sundial that I'd made in Sharjah. So. I'd like to do it more. I think that again, it's like the kind of infinite density thing. I feel like at some point it's like you kind of do have your zone of your. I mean, yeah. Again, it's like yeah. I think I would like to do it more, but I don't do it. Of course, you do it helplessly, right? Like you actually don't really. I'll think I'm on a totally different topic, and then it turns out I'm just on the same thing I'm always on. It turned out that I started writing this whole thing recently about like C.L.R. James, the concept of leadership, and then I realized it was again just about like, you know, like wow, it really matters who, like it's something about like, it was basically about like contingency and fate and like the individual and history or whatever. And I was like, oh, it's just always the same thing. Somehow you're always on the same thing, even if you're not on the same thing. So in that sense, I obviously come back to things, but I don't think I don't intentionally do that. No, I don't think not as much as maybe I should.
There's one connected question that's coming here in the chat, and apologies to all those others that have come in. This is going to be the last one I've got time for, but it seems like a natural bridge here, and it's a question that's come from Tony, saying that the connection you've described of editing film and the creation of your own written work sounds very connected to the work that curators do when pulling together exhibitions, sort of arranging things, I guess, and rearranging things. And so the question is, do you feel like the act of editing is a key thread through all the different parts of your practice, exhibition making, the way you write, and then literally as an editor of other people's writing?
I mean, yeah, you could. I mean, I think editing it's a bit like it's such a like massive. It's such a big it's such a capacious practice / concept, right? It's like, I think I'm obviously very interested in editing. I think I had a really weird, not weird, but I had so I was being edited very intense. I wrote this thing for Jewish Currents magazine. They're very intense editors. They kept consoling me for the fact that we went through like 7 rounds of edits by saying, which I was completely overwhelmed by and I hated. And they were like, we edited this Judith Butler piece. We went through like 50 edits for this Judith Butler piece or something. And I was like, well, that's stupid, whatever. I hate being edited. I really don't like it. I try and be like nice. I mean, sometimes I'm like pleasantly surprised because I'm like, oh, that is an improvement. But I'm generally like extremely tense about it. And I said something on Twitter about that, and then a few people were like, I love being edited, and then I was like, oh, you seem very pro-relational or something. And I kind of realized that I was thinking about in relation to psychoanalysis, because I think that's one of the things I've had to kind of undo in terms of like being an analysis, is the idea that I'm just doing it myself, because that was my fantasy of analysis. I was like the perfect analyst is like a severe Freudian who says nothing, and you just basically do everything yourself, and it's all about your projections and your own like internal fantasies and so on. So I think there's something with editing where I kind of like obsessively self-edit. So the other thing is like it's like I'm doing it myself or whatever. So by the time like anything's seen the light of day, I've extremely rigidly gone over and over and over it, and so then I'm like horrified if someone wants to add another edit. So the way that relates with and a kind of weird thing I do in terms of like making stuff is like a lot of people I know who like make objects in a more sort of luxurious and sensual way will do like multiple versions of it, and it's like getting to know the material and so on. I don't do that, because what I do is I sit and think and decide if it's the right thing to do. And then so like when I work collaboratively, people are often like, why don't we just try it? And I'm like, we can't try it unless we know it's good. Or that it's like a legitimate thing to try, kind of. So I think sometimes editing can be a kind of block or whatever, or like self-editing can be a kind of block, and it might be interesting to think more about how things are edited by others. But yeah, I mean, I think editing is a super capacious concept. It's always fun to think about, yeah, and it's like kind of necessary in terms of writing, like working with other editors. I think sometimes edits can be really gratuitous, and it's just someone just wants to kind of impose their own sense of things on the piece and like so on. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's like, I mean, obviously in terms of like doing, the activity of like making stuff, I think so almost doesn't rely on kind of concepts, kind of like, it's just, if you see that in it, I'm happy for you to see editing across all these things, but I wouldn't say I'm particularly like guided by the idea that what I'm doing is editing, or that I'm an editor. I don't think I'm I'm a good editor of myself. I don't know if I'm an amazing editor of other people, although I think I'm good at and so yeah, I think there's something about just like trying to see from the other person's position that can make, which I do try and do. But yeah,
there's well, you're getting a big thank you from the person who asked the question, so apparently it was a very good answer. So don't worry. There are also several requests asking whether or not the video works can be seen anywhere outside of the exhibitions, but I don't know. For those who are asking in the chat, the Contemporary Art Daily website might be a place to start to see. That's really kind, Hannah, thank you. And it's a really nice way to wrap up an incredibly generous session. To everyone who asked questions, I hope I did at least a half decent job of voicing them on your behalf. And if anything didn't get answered, it's my fault. So apologies, but Hannah's kindly put her email there in the chat if you want to get in contact and ask her something more directly.
Email, but maybe I'll get around to it. So much, thank you for being here. That's really yeah, it's really fun and interesting to talk with you all. So, or mediated by Nick. Yeah.
So I'd like to thank all the panelists from the previous sessions today, yesterday, Eleanor for another fantastic keynote yesterday afternoon. I'm going to hand back over to Simran from the Association for Art History, who I think is going to give up the wrap up, as it were. But I'll clap on everyone's behalf, Hannah. Thank you. It was brilliant.
Yes, thank you, Hannah. It was really great to hear all about your work and creative process. And thank you to Nick for chairing that discussion and fielding all those questions. You did a brilliant job.